When an audio design engineer starts making a new product, they have to begin with some very early decisions. Should they use tubes or solid-state circuitry? Tubes are great for richness and smoothness. Solid-state is known for clarity and precision. Should they use a non-oversampling R2R DAC design, maybe an oversampling R2R design, or maybe go full-on oversampling Delta Sigma? Some people feel that the R2R DACs sound more natural, more lifelike. Some will say especially the non-oversampling ones. Others would say that those lack clarity and definition and attack and favour Delta Sigma, saying that that's the only way to properly and accurately decode the signal. So does that mean that a non-oversampling R2R DAC using tubes will be a mushy, overly warm and inaccurate sonic disaster? Let's find out. Linear Tube Audio is a company built on the foundation of producing lovely, resolving, and clear-sounding tube amps. In other words, they've proven themselves incredibly capable of making wonderful analog devices. Well, now they've gone and dabbled in the digital realm. Let's talk about why maybe they should have stuck to their lane. At $3,950 US, the Linear Tube Audio Aero DAC is not cheap. It's more expensive than other very well-regarded DACs like the Schiit Yggdrasil, the LAiV Harmony DAC, the Chord TT2, and the Holo Spring KTE. It's also using a combination of a non-oversampling R2R design and tubes, which is very rarely done, if at all. It's also seemingly a very simple DAC. There's no oversampling, there's no digital filtering, there's no feedback, it's only got USB, optical, and coaxial inputs, and it will only accept sample rates up to 192 kHz. So there's no DSD, and there's no using HQ player to output 368 or 786 kHz. It's all very, very simple. On the surface, the Linear Tube Aero looks like a tone-deaf entrant into a DAC market that's full of Swiss Army knife, do-everything DACs. Sometimes though, doing the simple thing is more difficult than doing something complex. And sometimes it's also better. By keeping everything really simple in the signal path, Linear Tube Audio have produced a wonderfully natural sounding DAC. But that's been achieved through some very careful decision making and some very careful circuit design in other areas. Firstly, if they weren't going to apply a whole lot of filtering and adjustment of the signal coming out of the digital stage of the DAC, then they had to begin with very high quality digital to analog conversion. And they achieved this with the selection of the Analog Devices AD1865 DAC chip. That's a non-oversampling R2R DAC chip that's used in some super premium products. Next, they paid great attention to the power supply in the Aero, and that was to ensure that they separated the analog and the digital sides of the circuit and produced a very stable and clean power supply that wasn't going to muck up either the digital side of the decoding or the analog output side of things. If you want to know more about that, you can read up more on the Linear Tube Audio website. I'll link in the description down below. Something else to consider is that DAC chips, most DAC chips and particularly the one used here, output a variable current output. In other words, the voltage stays fixed and the current does the varying with the signal. But what the output stage needs is a variable voltage. And so most DACs will need to have what they call a current to voltage conversion stage. And if that's not handled well, the performance of the DAC can vary at different frequencies. And so instead of the passive conversion process that's used in many DACs, Linear Tube Audio developed a more complex, active system that's going to adapt itself to make sure that you're always getting the ideal performance levels out of the DAC chip. And so in other words, this DAC is really complex on the inside, so it can be really simple on the outside. And then after all of that, the output stage in the Aero, the bit that interfaces with your preamp, your integrated amp, or your headphone amp, that uses tubes. And specifically, it runs through one of Linear Tube Audio's very well regarded ZOTL designs. I'm not going to go into depth on that one here, but I've talked a lot about it in the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 review that you can check out after this if you want to. But the long and the short of it is that the ZOTL circuits provide a wonderfully transparent, clean, and almost solid state like tube delivery, but with all the benefits of tubes as well. So the naturality, the fluidity, the ease of listening, but clarity, resolution, and no sense of thickness. So that's the output stage in the Aero. Now, of course, the quality of the inputs, noise rejection, galvanic isolation, all of that came into play as well for linear tube audio. And so you'll find that the inputs on the Aero DAC all perform equivalently. Whether you're running USB in, whether you're running optical in or coaxial in, each of those can be equally as good, assuming that the source is equally as good as well. In other words, if you've got a crappy USB output on your device, it may sound better using a coaxial output from that device, but that's about the upstream device, not about the Aero DAC. If all things are equal, the Aero performs equally across all inputs. When I compared the Aero recently to a bunch of other excellent DACs, the characteristic that consistently stood out to me as being the strong point of the Aero was its sense of tonality and timbre. In other words, how natural everything sounded from this DAC, and that is to say, exceptionally natural. It has a sense of richness and fullness to the sound, but it's in just the right amount. Everything sounds natural from this DAC, not rich or warm, and not clinical or sterile. It finds the perfect balance point. When compared to other DACs like the aforementioned Schiit Yggdrasil Plus MIB, the LAiV Harmony DAC, and another mystery DAC that I'm going to keep a mystery for now, the Aero produced the best soundstage size of all of them when considering both width and depth of the soundstage. The mystery DAC did stretch a little bit wider, but it wasn't larger overall. The Aero also comfortably delivered the most pleasing tonality across the board, but it wasn't a complete win for the Aero on all counts. One area that I consistently hear R2R DACs fall a little bit short of their multi-bit and delta sigma cousins is in things like detail retrieval and resolution. And that's true of the Aero too. You can hear that it's not quite delivering the same levels of texture, detail, and very fine sort of micro resolution, micro textures, whatever you want to call them. It's not quite matching a DAC like the Schiit Yggdrasil in that regard. If you weren't comparing them side by side, you would never think the Aero was lacking anything. But that's why I compare them side by side. Having said that, whether that difference is a bad thing is very personal. Some people crave every last little bit of insight into the music, and I get that because I love that too. But there's others that are more interested in a relaxing, enjoyable and immersive musical experience, and it's not about the detail. For others still, you might have an aggressive system with bright speakers or a room with lots of high frequency reflective surfaces, and you might actually need a DAC that just tames things a little bit. In summary, what I'm saying here is that the right DAC and the right levels of texture and detail depend on you, your system, the room you're listening in, even your preferences on the day sometimes. And so yes, the Aero is not quite as resolving and textured as some other DACs, but it's definitely not lacking. It's definitely not overly warm or rich or smooth. And so if you are looking for a DAC that takes just a little bit of the edge off the sense of attack and high frequency energy and detail and texture, the Aero is magnificent. So the Aero isn't going to win any medals for detail retrieval, but it's absolutely going to win medals for the sheer musical enjoyment it delivers. And so if musical enjoyment is where it's at for you, the Aero is one you should look at. Of the 4 DACs that I tried in my DAC off with the Aero, only the mystery DAC was truly competing with the Aero for my overall enjoyment of the music. You'll have to subscribe if you want to know what that mystery DAC is, because I haven't finished forming my full thoughts on it and I don't want to jump the shark on that one until I've spent more time with it. However, it is important to know that the Aero was the most expensive DAC in the DAC off. By the end of my listening and comparisons between all 4 DACs, it came down to a decision for me between the Aero and the mystery DAC as to which one I thought was best. And that decision actually came down to which amp, which music track, and which headphones I was using. With the Headphone 2, I preferred the mystery DAC, but with the Susvara Unveiled, yes, they're here, I prefer the Linear Tube Audio Aero DAC. And that's because the Aero delivered a little bit more weight and body to the sound that really helps the Unveiled to sound their best. What was slightly off-putting though, was that the much cheaper mystery DAC was going head to head with the more expensive Aero. And so at that point, I decided to pack things up, put everything away for the night because I was getting tired, and continue building my impressions of the Aero back here in my office for the next couple of days. And I'm so glad I did. Once I was back in my office, I was able to compare the Aero to the Chord DAC. I had both of them running into the Burson Audio Voyager amp and driving the Susvara Unveiled. On a rock track like Wonderwall, the top end, the treble, is crisper from a DAC like the DAC. But that can actually be too much sometimes, depending on the track and the setup that you're using. Adding the M scaler to the mix does help with this a little bit, but it also blows the budget way out of the water when we're comparing it to the Aero DAC. I mean, the DAC is already 3 to 4 times the price of the $4,000 Aero, so adding the M scaler really didn't make sense here. Continuing with just the DAC and the Aero, in other words, no M scaler in the mix, I found that the bass had a little bit more weight and presence to it from the DAC, and the separation of sounds is a bit stronger too. In comparison, the Aero is a little bit thick sounding, and that helps the DAC to produce a greater sense of width and separation in the soundstage, whereas the Aero tends to focus you in a little bit towards the middle, towards the mid-range, towards the main solo vocalist or instrumental, which could be a good thing, it all depends on you. Switching to a simpler track with better recording like Perfect Blue Buildings showed that the DAC also delivers a little bit more sense of nuance and detail in the high end. Sounds like hi-hats and cymbal hits. There's a touch more texture in the vocals too. But before you think that this is a rout of the Aero by the DAC, we do need to consider a couple of things. Firstly, a reminder that the DAC is 3 to 4 times the price of the Aero. It should be vastly better. And then secondly, the timbre or the tonality of the Aero is flat out perfect. The Aero is noticeably a little bit creamier through the mids, and that actually makes it more akin to the optimal version of the DAC with the M scaler attached. In other words, for those not chasing extreme micro details and nuance and every last texture and piece of clarity in the sound, the Aero is delivering a DAC-like level of timbre and tonality without the DAC and the M scaler price tag. It doesn't quite match the DAC in terms of staging, separation of sound, focus of the image, but its tonality, naturalness and timbre is as good as anything I've heard at any price.
And
in other words, the Linear Tube Audio Aero DAC is, I think, the best DAC I've heard, short of far more expensive options like the Chord TT2, the Holo Audio May KTE, and of course the Chord DAC. You might be losing a tiny bit of resolution, but you're getting a double dosing of tonal wonder and musical enjoyment. I said earlier that I thought Linear Tube Audio maybe should have stuck to their lane and continued producing analog product only, and that's because they might have just completely upended the market and our expectations of DACs within the market. So I take that back. I'm glad they went rogue. If you want to go rogue as well and have yourself a wonderfully simple NOS R2R Tube DAC, I'll put links down below where you can go through to Linear Tube Audio and check it out for yourself. As always, I want to say a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks here on videos like this one. If you like the general sound of the tonality and timbral accuracy of the Linear Tube Aero, but you want something even better, I'll put my link up here to the Chord DAC review. For now though, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.